What up, homies? I'm TK Fareed, and this is my first ever YouTube video. For my debut, I present to you this epoxy river console table that I made in my very small shop with only these 4 tools. I did this project just as a fun experiment to test out how minimally I could do a basic river inlay, so this isn't really a step-by-step tutorial or how-to video, but hopefully you'll be entertained and maybe you'll learn something along the way with me. So if you're down for that kind of thing, then let's get into it, my dudes. And by let's, I mean me. So first things first, I picked out some dimensional walnut from a local lumber shop, and the kindly old sage who owns it was equal parts confused and impressed when I pulled out my circular saw, a straight edge, and some clamps out of my trunk to cut it to the exact measurements I needed to fit it in my Camry. I am 100% that hood rat cutting lumber in the Lowe's parking lot while strangers openly judge me. After doing this for 2 years, it doesn't even faze me anymore, so whatever, cause you ugly. Then I was off to go weird out all my neighbors with the soothing sounds of machinery noise, and also make a huge mess in my backyard, per usual. In my next video, I'll be doing a full deep dive on how I create a faux live edge on rough cut dimensional lumber, so I won't get too deep into it for now, but pretty much I just used 40 grit sandpaper to sculpt a more rugged, organic looking shape into the straight flat edges of this wood, and then I softened it with 120 grit and then stepped up to 220. Axel enjoyed doing his own version of woodworking as I very slowly cut the center out of this piece of wood. I don't know what gave me the impression that if I went into this with lots of motivation and enthusiasm, then it would be a relatively quick and painless process, but I ended up having to make 800,000 relief cuts per section. So yeah, it took forever. Accomplishing this one task took years off my lifespan. To prep the wood for my epoxy pour, I decided, as usual, to live life on the dangerous side. I just used a shit ton of Tyvek tape on the underside of my slab to make a cute little container to cradle my epoxy until it was strong enough to survive on its own. I ran around the perimeter of the void with silicone to make a little dam that would keep the forbidden water inside of the river where it belongs. I don't always do this, but since I was really doing the bare minimum here in terms of prep work, I decided to go for it. So my table is literally made of garbage. I got a piece of plywood from Lowe's and I stuck some cute table legs on it, and then I covered the top of it with peel and stick laminate flooring so I can use it as like a photo backdrop, but it's literally just some. So to keep myself from having to do extra work that I don't want to do, I want to make sure that it's level before I pour my resin and potentially waste anything, because resin is expensive, especially the deep pour stuff. Okay, so it looks like that worked. It's not perfectly centered, but it's pretty damn close. Good enough for government work. Right now my studio is the second bedroom in my apartment, so whenever I'm working with epoxy, I close the space off from the rest of the house, open both windows, and wear a 3M chemical respirator to keep my little air sac safe. I work alone most of the time, so I gotta find creative ways to keep myself entertained.
I'm Brent Jeff Keys. I'm your host, Ashley Flowers. And I'm Brent.
Sometimes I listen to early 2000s emo playlists that my sister sends me, but the majority of the time I'm listening to one of my favorite true crime podcasts and ugly dancing to the intro song. I was super excited to finally try out the Moss Epoxy's deep pour system for this project because you can pour up to 2 inches in thickness at a time. So in theory, I would be able to do this whole table in one pour. I say in theory because I actually ended up doing 2 pours because the initial pigment that I chose was more gray than I wanted it to be. So I just had to wait about 24 hours for the epoxy to cure enough that I could pour a second layer on top of the first one. Also, I don't know what the f that noise was, but I thought it was hilarious because I'm a child, so I left it in there. You're welcome. I know this is basically everyone's favorite part of these kinds of projects, so here is some satisfying footage for your eye holes, set to the modern equivalent of smooth jazz. Okay, This is where I fucked up. Cannot for the life of me explain why I thought it would be perfectly acceptable practice to prop up my dust cover on top of, well, you'll see in a minute, but for now, just enjoy this array of faces I made while trying to cover this up. All right, it's been 2 days. I think she's ready to play. So we had some wins and we had some losses. Mostly wins, but we had some losses. Big win. There were no leaks. So the Tyvek tape held up a-okay. The loss, however, we had a moment. I stupidly had this propped up just on top of this, but it fell over and it ended up getting stuck. Luckily I got to it before it cured, so that's great, but it's still cured all lumpy, bumpy, and gumpy in here, so I'm going to sand this part down by hand before I pour the next layer on here. Even though the gunmetal gray was a really pretty color, it's just not what I had envisioned for this specific project, so I poured over the top of it with some jet black, like my soul. So I'm going to be trying out this quick curing casting resin to fill in this little oopsie hole, and try saying that 5 times fast. Quick curing casting resin. Supposedly this stuff cures in like just a couple of hours and then it'll be ready to rock out with the rest of this thing. Okay, so this part was fun because the Tyvek tape ripped off all my fingerprints like I was preparing to rob a bank. But I'll take it, because any tape that's strong enough to make my fingertips feel like the inside of a lobster tail is strong enough to keep my resin from leaking all over the table. Fun fact, I hate sanding. Wet sanding, dry sanding, hand sanding, sandblasting, you name it, I pretty much hate them all. I've started trying to use this time to practice patience, which FYI is not one of my strong suits. I don't think it's working. Unfortunately for me, sanding makes up a large portion of most epoxy projects, so as long as I plan on doing this, I'm just gonna have to suck it up and find a way to make it fun. For instance, your keen eye has probably picked up on the fact that this portion of the video is dark as fuck, and that's because I was sick of working on this project at this point, but I really wanted to get it done so I wouldn't have to think about it anymore, so I moved this bad boy downstairs to my living room so I could eat pizza and binge watch The Vampire Diaries as if I had never seen it before. This actually worked out really well since I'm super food motivated, so this ended up being a pretty good way for me to get over that hump and hit my second win so I can finish up this god-awful part of the process. I asked my friend Jared Davis for a good buffing compound, and this is what he recommended. So to get this finish, I buffed this bad boy 2 times. The first time I applied higher pressure at a lower RPM, and the second time I applied less pressure at higher RPM. Then I applied some good old Rubio monocoat wood oil plus the 2C hardener to finish the wood, and then I just slapped some legs on this dude, and that was it. This project took quite a while and a lot of work to complete, but it was really worth it because it just immediately improved the functionality and aesthetic of my weird shaped living room, and that's literally what I'm all about. A simple design like this is the perfect solution for multiple common problems you have in smaller, awkward shaped spaces like the one that I have. I can use this as a workspace, an eating area, additional seating for the guests that I never have, or simply as a horizontal surface to accumulate random things that I don't feel like putting away. If you enjoyed watching this video, and only if you feel like I've earned it, then go ahead and like and subscribe as a little way of saying to me, that'll do, pig. That'll do. Keep an eye out for my next video where I will be tackling the biggest project that I've done to date in a fun collab with one of my new friends from way down south in the state of Georgia. Catch you later, homies.